They say it's hard to talk about visual topics in an audio-only medium.
We take that as a challenge.
I'm Grayson.
I'm Ezra.
And welcome back to I Can't Believe We're Still Allowed on the Air, aka Are We Doing This Right on WEGL 91.1 in Auburn. All right, so the first one we're going to deal with today is shapes that kind of define our computers, and mainly standardized shapes.
All right.
And a lot of this is something that you and I are very familiar with, so I just want you to be on guard and warn me if I'm getting too much into I'm speaking to Ezra and not the radio. So
I got you.
Because we have done that before. The first one that we're going to deal with is ports. There are a couple that we use every day, but going back to really the start of personal computing, the main port was this thing called the D-sub. This is the trapezoidal connector that's, you would think of as like a VGA port or a serial port. These are actually the most common standardized form of ports early on in computing and through really the 90s and the early 2000s.
Is there a reason they had that shape? I know that the kind we're talking about are like kind of big compared to the more common things you see today.
Right. There's a couple advantages. The biggest one is that it's non-reversible. So you can't plug in an upside down, which is important as it wasn't just used for like keyboards and mice and stuff. It was also used for connecting big machines. Even to this day, the old style printer port, the really wide ones, the DB25, is used on CNC machines sometimes because it can just pulse the individual axes. The big thing also with them is that they can be either serial or parallel. And what that means is that you can have more wires sending out more data all at once, or you can have one wire sending out single bits of data. That's serial. But
why is it important that they're not upside down?
So it's a couple things. If you got the data ports wrong, obviously you're going to send the wrong things. But these also carried power sometimes, and computers for a long time aren't as well protected as they are now on their data ports. So if you accidentally sent power down the wrong line, it's going to be a bad time, effectively. So if you can't plug them in backwards, that's a big deal. Also, that versatility mattered a lot more when computing speeds were slower for the serial versus parallel thing. Now, these have mainly been superseded by USB, probably my favorite computer connector, if that's a thing you can actually have a favorite of.
At least it's one we're all familiar with.
Right, and that's what the first letter in USB means, universal. That's actually a big selling point of these, is that you really only need one connector, and the speeds are fast enough and it's reliable enough and it can carry enough current that one square connector can carry everything.
Yeah, it can be used for charging stuff or for transmitting data or whatever else.
Exactly. And the USB-A that we're most familiar with, the kind that you'd not plug into your phone, but plug into the charging brick, is non-reversible. It's actually been around with fewer pins since the start of the USB standard. The one that's had the most problems within the implementation of USB is the micro form factors. So these are, if you've ever had an Android phone or something that charged based on them, these are those smaller connectors. Though the biggest problem between these is they carry all the benefits of USB, but they're also extremely fragile, which has been a problem for me. I've had a couple devices rendered nearly useless by those tiny little ports breaking off.
Yeah, they bend really easily.
Yeah, exactly. They're so small that while the utility is in how small they are, they were somewhat poorly designed. They break off too easily. They tend to be brittle. They stick out pretty far. And they're not designed for any sort of thick metal to be around the connector. It's designed to be very thin. And we have had many problems with these over the years, and including my least favorite of all of these, the USB 3 version of these. I don't know if you've ever seen these. They're more common on USB hard drives and stuff. But they're like a USB micro, but wider.
Oh,
so,
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, they can carry data at all the higher speeds and stuff of USB 3, but they're just as fragile, and they're just as terrible, and they're just as non-reversible, which is why I think we have my favorite iteration of smaller USB yet, USB-C.
Beautiful.
They went and made it an oval. Thank you. It is reversible, it's high speed, and I think it's becoming ubiquitous for a good thing. It's even starting to be featured on motherboards.
These are the kind of USB ports you see on modern Android phones and most like small modern devices. They're the USB that you can turn upside down and you can't plug it in the wrong way.
Right. They're also the only connectors on like modern MacBooks and things like that. They can also carry a lot of current, much more than old USB, so they can function as your USB, as your laptop's charger.
So they're USB, but even more universal.
Right. Now, I mentioned motherboards. Motherboards actually have a big deal with standardized sizing within the ATX standard. Now, you and I have both built computers, but we've obviously done it in post-2010-ish. And the big thing with those is that building computers, while it's hard at the outset or hard doing it your first time, it's pretty easy once you know what you're doing. It's very much everything clicks into place and everything is, there's only one place to plug everything in.
It's like very expensive Legos.
Exactly. And the only reason we can do that is the ATX standard. Now, I actually didn't know this, but this was only introduced as late as 1995 by Intel. So the thing that allows people to build their own computers easily was something that didn't come along until well into the 90s. Before that, really all your options were to buy a pre-built machine and modify it and upgrade it if you didn't want to finagle with it and try and find all the exact parts you needed.
Yeah.
It's made the entire thing much more accessible. It also makes it much easier to repair modern computers. Now, not everybody uses the ATX system, but a lot of people will at least use their power supplies. So if you, most of the time, have an HP, you can swap the power supply if it goes out with just an off-the-shelf model where you would never even be able to come close before.
It's all somewhat standardized, so it's easier to mix and match stuff.
Right. The one other thing with motherboards and computers in general is the server rack. So server racks, they are this fixture of data centers. They hold all the computers in a vertical configuration. They're about 6 feet tall each. They are a standardized size. So each rack is 19 inches wide, and each width of the rack is 1.752 inches tall, or 44.5 millimeters. That's called a U in terms of rack.
Interesting.
So when you're buying servers and stuff, there'll be 1U, 2U, 3U. But what this effectively means is that everything is standardized and it's easy to keep it organized. And these have been associated with computing for as long as we've been doing it. Even the old, room-sized computers were built based on this architecture.
So we've managed to keep that standardized since all the way when computers were as big as rooms?
It actually comes from way before when computers were big as rooms. The racks were first pioneered by AT&T in the early 1910s. If you're not familiar, AT&T, before the 80s when they were broken up by antitrust lawsuits, were the only real telephone system in the United States. So they had tons and tons of equipment that they needed to keep racked up and organized and safe in one room. And so they developed the original racking standards through the 20s and 30s for communications equipment. And that was the earliest use of them. Now, AT&T was also heavily involved with the early development of computer systems, mainly because they really fit AT&T's workload for shuttling digital audio and things like that. Bell Labs was kind of like the Google of its day. You can thank it for a lot of things: digital voice encoding, the C programming language. Those were all created by people working for and at AT&T. And they created this rack standard, and once people affiliated with AT&T that were building the first computers or who had worked at AT&T and were now in academia building these computers, they carried over that rack system because it works well for communications gear and it's a similar workload.
And so I guess since then it's become even more widely adopted.
Exactly. And it's not even a computer-only thing. It's actually used heavily in audio and broadcast equipment. On my side of the desk here in the studio, we have a lot of stuff in these standardized 19-inch racks, like our CD players and our voice compressors that we use on the microphones. So it's ended up being this thing that started for a very specific use case within one company that has expanded greatly because of how universal its shape is. The one last thing I want to talk about before we go on this segment is computer peripherals. Now, we've talked about weird peripherals before, and we know exactly how they can go bad when you design them poorly. I don't think it would be a stretch to say that you and I aren't really the biggest Apple fans.
Of course.
But what is described as one of their biggest mistakes is their first USB mouse. So this is called the Puck mouse by people who pay attention to Apple history. It was created from 1998 to 2000, and it came with the first generation of what we would consider the iMac. So the one that was CRT based, it was all colorful, translucent plastic, very 90s design. And it was this mouse that was so uncomfortable to use because it was a circle. It looked like a hockey puck. So not only was it hard to hold, it would rotate unintentionally on your desk, so you had to look down and orient the thing every time you wanted to use your mouse and point with a cursor. And it's strange that this would come from Apple, because the mouse was such a huge part of their brand early on that like it was one of the things that set them apart from their competitors. And they've had lots of cool mice over the years, but they just messed it up really bad with this one.
I guess they wanted to stand out from the competition, but in doing so, they made something that was really just unusable.
Yeah, they definitely stood out. This one specifically, there was so much of a negative response to it that companies were almost built, like Griffin, made a ton of money selling adapters that would let you use the old Apple mice that used a proprietary connector, like a serial connector, on the new USB systems, and even a thing that would go around your mouse to make it less of a circle. So we see that these little changes that, shapes can make that have this ultimately huge impact on your product and your experience with it. All right, when we come back, 3D modeling and the polygon.
Welcome back to Are We Doing This Right? So continuing with the idea of shapes, I want to talk a little bit about polygonal modeling. And so first, a definition. Polygonal modeling refers to one of the two types of 3D modeling techniques. And the first one we're probably more familiar with is CAD modeling, or computer-aided design. And that's the modeling that you typically see engineers and architects do when they're creating models for something that they want to print. Now, CAD modeling, it's not exactly the most intuitive, and it has some limitations. The reason why, basically, with CAD, you model stuff by drawing lines and extruding those lines. It's kind of a leftover of back when people used to draw out models by hand on pen and paper. And they would draw different views, like they would draw it from the front, they would draw it from the side, they would draw it from the top. CAD modeling is an extension of that. You basically draw out what you want to look from the front, the top, and the side, and then you extrude or pull out the shapes from those drawings.
Right. It's a very easy to visualize process, especially when you're making a product, but it's not necessarily intuitive for certain things.
Yeah, both types have different advantages and disadvantages. Polygonal modeling, it refers to the process of creating models out of vertices, edges, and faces, and I'll describe that a little bit more in a second. But with CAD modeling, it's very easy to do something like make a screw or sketch out how like a building's going to look. Now, if you were to try to do something like make a tree or a flower in a CAD modeling program, you would find yourself struggling. It might be possible, but it's gonna look mechanical. It's going to look rigid, just because that's not what the tool is built for.
Right.
Polygonal modeling is the kind of modeling that is used for anything from like CGI to any sort of real graphical design, because it has a whole lot more artistic freedom, and it's also a lot lighter on computer processing. And the reason it is because it all goes back to the idea of a vertex, an edge, and a face. And so the way to visualize that is it's like you have a dot, you have a line, and then you have 3 or 4 dots that you've connected and filled in between.
So it's like you could kind of think of it like in dimension-wise, like you're getting a face when you make the 3.
Yep.
So it's like a 2D shape. Effectively.
Yeah. It's like if you imagine drawing a little thing on a piece of paper, like connecting dots together, it's that, but of course you then have a third axis. So at that point it becomes 3D. It's really just an extension of those old connect the dot puzzles you do as kids. But because all you're doing is connecting dots, then whatever is processing your drawing or your model, it only has to process the data in between the dots. It doesn't have to try to keep... It's only calculating points in a 3-dimensional space. It's not trying to create perfectly smooth surfaces or anything like that CAD models do. And 3D modeling, or polygonal 3D modeling, has some weird things that have sort of developed over the years as this technique was created and became more common. So it all started really in 1975 in Utah.
Why Utah?
There were just some people all over the world were working on different ways to visualize 3D data on computers. But this person in Utah, he had written a program to do this, and he wanted to kind of create a universal shape that could demonstrate sort of advanced techniques for the time. So this professor, he was working with the university, and he was having tea with his wife, and they were talking about what model they wanted to use to kind of show this new technology that he was working with, and they realized that the teapot right in front of them was the perfect shape, and this was the birth of the Utah teapot, which is sort of famous in 3D modeling circles. Now, the reason why the teapot was the perfect shape is because it has a hole in it in the top for the teapot, it has curves for the handle, and the whole thing's smooth. It's all three of those things were really advanced in 1975, especially like the hole for the handle.
Mm-hmm.
That it kind of demonstrates the bare bones of every individual thing a modeling program needed to be able to do at the time. So this teapot actually has made some famous appearances. It is visible in some early animated films like the original Toy Story and Monsters, Inc. It's had features in The Simpsons. It's very common to just see this teapot in the background in a movie or whatever else. And it was also one of the first 3D printed models. It's kind of had a resurgence as people have found more uses for polygonal 3D modeling. And in 2009, some people, I think in Arizona, developed a ceramic 3D printer. And they, of course, printed the Utah teapot because it makes sense to print the teapot if you're printing with ceramics.
Right.
In 2015 in California, with the improvement of 3D printers and the idea of using different things as printing filament, you had a company print the Utah teapot out of tea itself.
Wait, hold on. How does that work?
They it just like how a 3D printer is drawing like plastic filament on a surface. They kind of did the same thing, but with ground up tea leaves. So you had this solid pot made of tea.
Wow. Technology is great.
Yeah. So the Utah teapot is it's considered a primitive, and a primitive is the idea of taking a shape and then using that as a basis for a model. If you're making something like a screwdriver, it's much easier to start with a cylinder than to start with a cube. So a lot of modeling programs, both when they were first being created and now, they use different primitives. So there are some other famous ones other than just the Utah teapot. My personal favorite is Suzanne. And so Suzanne is a detached monkey head, and it's a primitive used in the program that's now known as Blender. Mm-hmm. In 1998, a company called Not a Number Technologies, or NAN, they created this modeling tool, and they decided to release it for free. And it was kind of lackluster. It didn't have a lot of the features that the other tools had, but it was one of the first free tools available. And they went bankrupt in 2002. But the last thing that they added to their modeling program was a kind of an Easter egg. They decided they were going to create their own primitive, and they created this perfect polygonal monkey head called Suzanne, named after one of the developers. He had watched some movie recently that he really liked, and there was a monkey named Suzanne in it, so they made it. And it was meant to be their last edition, but after the company went bankrupt, Blender got money donated from people who wanted to see the project continued, and then the Blender Foundation was formed, and they've been working on it since, iterating on the design and re-releasing it. But they've always kept Suzanne as a primitive, as kind of a reminder of where they came from, and they'll give away trophies that are printed and look like Suzanne the monkey at their awards for like excellence in animation.
So this is somewhat off topic, but was Blender open source that entire time, or just after the bankruptcy?
I think they went open source after the bankruptcy. That was part of why they raised money from the community. It was the idea of, if we can get enough money together, we can afford to take our technology and make it open source and then continue working on it. There's one other famous primitive, and that's the Stanford Bunny. So the Stanford Bunny, it's kind of like the other two. It's meant to be something that you can real quick put in a scene and make sure that everything's working properly because it's more complicated than a cube or a cylinder. But it comes from a different origin. It wasn't something that someone modeled. It was actually scanned. It was the first real proof that you could scan an object in the real world and convert it into a 3D model. They created this system using like lasers to get the surface of a model and then assign polygons and vertices in a 3D space to represent it. So one of the people in Stanford working on it just found a ceramic bunny in someone's office. He put it on the scanner and it worked. And so in most modeling programs, you'll see either the Utah Teapot, Suzanne the monkey, or the Stanford Bunny.
When was that scanner created?
I think the late 90s.
Ah.
It was really, I didn't realize that 3D model scanning was really a thing back then. It's still something that's becoming more accessible. In general, polygon modeling, there's been a lot of moves to make it more accessible. Way back when these tools were first being created, you had to assign every vertex in three-dimensional space by hand, writing it on a document. And of course, it's really hard to visualize something like a monkey when you're just typing in a bunch of numbers. So now you have, it's all graphics based. You're dragging and dropping vertices and putting them where you want them to be. It's very easy and intuitive. And as we look into the future, it's actually becoming easier because things like model scanning are planned to be more accessible on phones as phones get better sensors for their camera. So you can just take a bunch of pictures of something and then have a rudimentary model made out of it. And even further in the future, VR and AR tools are being created to allow you to manipulate models with your hands like you're working with clay. And of course, that's even more intuitive.
All right, when we come back, the ideas that shape our signs. Welcome back to Are We Doing This Right on WEGL 91.1. Okay, so roadway signs, you don't ever really think of them or a time really before the current look of them, right?
I don't think about roadway signs at all.
Okay, Ezra. But even like looking at pictures from the 50s, they all look the same. They're pretty much the standard thing, especially things like stop signs and things like that. In the U.S., any roadway sign that's on a public road is controlled by an 862-page book called the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, published by the Federal Highway Administration. Great name. But you can get this PDF for free. And in that PDF, there is, on page 32, a table which lays out what every shape is that you can use for the signs and which ones are reserved specifically.
So do stop signs have to be shaped the way they are?
Yes, and nothing else can actually be shaped like an octagon. So the first one on that table is the octagon. So this has to be a stop sign no matter what. You can't have anything else that looks like it. You can't have anything that even like half an octagon. Nope. If it's an octagon, it is a stop sign.
I guess it makes sense because knowing when to stop is probably the most important part of driving.
Right, and knowing how to see that from like the other side or if the graphics are faded. That's an incredibly important thing. The upside down triangle, aka the yield, is next on that list. Nothing can be an upside down triangle except for yields. The circle, I'm not really sure what it's for, but it is reserved. The language is kind of vague about the circle. The upward pointing pentagon and the downward pointing pentagon. Now, the document claims that these are reserved even though they're both pentagons. The upward pointing one is for school zones. Downward pointing is for country routes. So the blue signs with the yellow lettering when you're on a road in like a rural area.
Interesting.
And then the crossbuck, which is just the railroad crossing sign. And I wouldn't have known that these were so like heavily regulated, but it makes sense looking back on those that, it makes sense that anything that is dealing with traffic control where you're either in a school zone or about to get hit by a train or coming up to a four-way stop, it matters the shapes of those signs.
It needs to be universally recognizable because otherwise you might get hit by a train.
Exactly. And the other thing I didn't realize about them is how somewhat new these are. So we think of them as standards and we think of them as, having been here forever. but they actually didn't exist until the early 20th century. I mean, these roadway signs are an invention of the car. So in the early 1900s, cars are still very much a rich man's game. They're expensive, unreliable, and many roads just aren't passable for them. So you have these people with lots of money and these cars. So what they do is they form automobile clubs. The most notable of these are AAA and the American Motor League, which later merged. The primary function of these clubs is to advocate for car users and to also advocate for roadways to be built. Now, when I say early, the first really accessible car, the Model T, didn't start coming out until 1908. And even then, it took a while for it to be really adopted. So you can think of the kind of money that these people are throwing around and the kind of influence these people can throw around. And so they started maintaining these rural highways. So these would be stretches of road that are maintained between cities, but they are maintained by each club using club funds and membership dues from each member. And most of the signage on there is mainly to promote the highway, more so than it is to promote safety. But it was the first real standardization of signage that we see, and it is driven by cars. In the mid 30s, some states kind of got fed up with the lack of standardization on these. By this time, cars are very much standardized. You're very used to these.
I mean, at that point, I guess most people probably could afford one.
Right. And so these Midwestern states, the Mississippi Valley really, not Midwestern, come together, and in 1927, they create the Manual for Specifications of Manufacture, Display, and Erection of United States Standard Road Markers and Signs.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah, it's a terrible name, but that one doesn't last that long. That one's just for rural settings. They create a completely different manual for urban settings. But this is the first time we see a government really taking control and controlling these in a large-scale sense over multiple states. Later in 1935, the first uniform standard was released, which is the first edition of what I referred to earlier, hereforth to be referred to as just the manual. The latest edition of that was actually 2009. I don't know what exactly they changed, but we're still iterating upon it.
Yeah,
fixing
it's still
things.
being updated. It's still relevant.
Right, and this isn't just sign shapes. This is also things like mandating the double yellow lines separating opposing lanes of traffic. Things like that.
It's just everything for roadways, pretty much.
Right. It's what makes it easy to drive in different states and not get completely off track because the laws are slightly different and the roads are a little different. All you have to really pay attention to is, making sure that the highways aren't notated a little bit differently. But even then, it's still pretty much the same iconography. That's really important for driver safety more than anything. You're moving faster. Being able to read these signs no matter where you are, no matter how light it is outside, the manual is the only thing that really makes that possible without having to do a lot of research beforehand like you'd have to do in, say, if you were driving in a foreign country. If you were going to Europe, you have to figure out their road laws and their road signage and everything. And you, thankfully, don't have to do that traveling state to state here. Now, across the rest of the world, there is no one single standard. There are a few, though, that are used in many, many places.
Are things like the stop sign being an Octagon standard for the most part?
Actually, yeah. The biggest part of Europe and some of Asia and Southeastern Asia, or Southwestern Asia rather, so places like India and some of the Middle East, they are governed by this thing called the Vienna Convention on road signals and signs. This is a document created by the UN that you can find a map of it. I'll tweet it out later. But it covers a lot of things, but it mandates certain things. And there are a few options for each stop sign. But the first one and the most recommended one is just still the red octagon with white outlines and stop in either English or the local language. So for most of the world and most of Europe, even if you can't read the specific sign, you'll still be able to interpret what it wants you to do.
Yeah.
And that's the most important part of that convention. Now, most of North America doesn't really adhere to that convention. Most notably, the United States and Canada, because we obviously have our own manuals. Canada's manual is very heavily based on ours. So a lot of things are the same. I've driven up through Canada, and what really caught me off guard was that, all the signs look the same. You wouldn't have been able to tell except that everything was in kilometers now. So For example, the speed in neighborhoods was now 50 instead of 25, and it scared me for a second, but it's easy to get off guard. Canada has like I said, it has its own manual, but their biggest difference is that they kind of stray away from using actual written language. So Canada has two official languages, French and English.
Yeah.
So for the most part, they are much more heavily reliant on things like iconography and pictograms, more so than anything else to display information. But most of their colors and everything are very similar to ours. Mexico is not quite as clear. They're similar to our manual, but they also have some ideas from the Vienna Convention in. They're actually they signed the convention, but they didn't actually ratify it. So it's not like rule of law there, but it's like their manual is heavily inspired by it.
Interesting.
Our manual is also pretty influential through a lot of South America, things like that. Now, we've talked a lot about safety so far. Like, most of our signs are vital pieces of roadway control that if they were gone, bad things would happen. But not everything is. The manual also lays out things like the national park signs. So if you've ever been on a highway and seen the upside down trapezoid that's brown with white lettering that's telling you where a national park is, that's actually a federally controlled sign.
Interesting.
So no matter where you are, those always look the same and they always point to the same kinds of places. And it's something that I wouldn't have expected from basically the bureaucracy that's, we need safety and nothing else, to be creating this iconography that points me towards national parks, a thing that I think you and I both like and care a lot about. But it's something that's so iconic since even the creation of the National Park Service, those signs have been there. It also, they have their own manual within the National Park Service called, again, just the manual of like signs and signals. It's not that creative and not as fun as the original manual. But this even covers things like the logos of the park and the actual large signs, not just roadway signs. And that's the most important thing about these. They function as logos.
Yeah.
Which is something we've talked a lot about on the show, but making those so identifiable and uniform can point you towards every single national park. And I think that really no other federally regulated sign acts like that as a kind of de facto logo for the thing it's advertising. That's what I think is so cool about those.
It's instantly recognizable. You know a park when you see one.
Exactly. And the looks of road signs are something we don't really consider a lot, I think, for the most part. But they're carefully designed objects that impact our daily lives all the time. They're safety devices, but they also signal cool national parks. And I think that's an aspect that's really neglected by people on the internet who, care about flags and such. It would be very much that kind of topic that I think people should care more about.
The aesthetics are important.
Mm-hmm. When we come back, the sheer importance of the hexagon.
Your best friends won't be your friends anymore. They won't pretend anymore to let you.
Welcome back to Are We Doing This Right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about hexagons, and specifically, anyone who knows me knows hexagons are my favorite shape.
Please explain.
Well, they look futuristic, and that makes them cool, and we're going to talk a little bit about why they look futuristic. But specifically, the Geodesic Dome is, while technically not made of hexagons, it's made of triangles arranged in a way that makes them look kind of like hexagons.
It's close enough.
It's an important distinction. But geodesic domes are these polyhedron domes that are composed of a bunch of triangles. And if it's hard to visualize that, just think of that big wall in front of Epcot at Disney. That is a geodesic dome, and that is arguably the most famous geodesic dome. The reason why these things are kind of cool is because by using like triangles in their construction, they can hold very, very heavy loads. Even given like their weight and the materials they're made out of. They are one of the most just resilient, efficient shapes with materials. Like, technically, they are like the most efficient arrangement for creating something like a house. But there's a reason why we don't all live in domes. Not yet, anyway.
Yet.
Yeah. So I always associate these things with kind of like futuristic, like force field looking things. Maybe I'm watching too much sci-fi, but these have been around since a little bit after World War One, and they were first designed to kind of serve as like a planetarium. In Germany, there was this large geodesic dome called the Wonder of Jena, and it was kind of the first one that I could find that was really constructed. And it was huge. You could fit a lot of people in it. It was later turned into kind of like a garden type thing.
Do you know what the actual height of it was off the top of your head?
I do not. From the pictures, it looked like probably 30, 40 feet tall from the middle. Anyway, so these construction, they kind of led to the design catching on. In particular, catching on in the eyes of the U.S. military. So the U.S. Marines actually, they started prototyping using these domes in battle with helicopters. And when I first read that headline, I thought it was helicopters carrying these domes and like deploying them on the field of battle for like shelter.
At the very least, it should have been.
Yeah, but unfortunately, it's not quite that cool. But the advantage, so these domes could be constructed very quickly, and they did not require much material for how much space that they carried. So a helicopter could carry all the materials needed to then, once it landed, the soldiers could construct a geodesic dome around the helicopter, and it could sustain blasts more efficiently than any other design really could. So it was you saw it a lot with like the Marines, where when they would park a helicopter on an aircraft carrier, and then people would construct these domes around the helicopter to keep it safe and protected.
What are these made of?
Kind of anything. You'd see a lot of like steel, metal, iron ones. I think steel was the one that the U.S. Marines were using. And another advantage is because it's just a bunch of triangles put together, it's actually really easy for the soldiers to figure out how to construct these. Same thing with construction workers. Making something like a dome out of a bunch of individual, basically like sticks, sounds hard, but it really wasn't, because you're just kind of assembling it like one triangle at a time.
Mm-hmm.
So after the use with the helicopters didn't really catch on. I'm not exactly sure why.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, maybe in the future. But the Geodesic Dome also served as the pavilion in the 1964 World's Fair. And this was a huge factor in why we kind of associate these things with the future. And immediately after the World Fair, which was a huge success, it was converted into an aviary, which I thought was kind of neat. And then in 1975, they constructed one of these on the South Pole to use as a research shelter. I think it's still there. I don't know if it's still used, but there's a cool little dome on the South Pole. Now, everyone's favorite, Epcot, well, specifically Spaceship Earth, the giant ball in front of Epcot, that was a geodesic dome constructed in 1982. And I think it was the largest at the time of construction.
Yeah, likely.
It's not the largest now, but it was huge and revolutionary. And I mean, it's what most people think of when they think of geodesic domes, not that most people are thinking of geodesic domes.
I didn't know about the World Fair thing until you mentioned it, but it makes a lot of sense that was brought into Epcot. Walt Disney was very much a believer in the World's Fair and a big fan of it. He had lots of pavilions there. But that makes sense that he pulled that into what his vision was for a city of the future when they built Epcot.
A lot of stuff from the World Fair kind of had that idea. In the 60s and 70s, it was kind of like theorized that everyone would live in one of these domes. You see it a lot if you ever look at what we now call retrofuturism, the propaganda of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. You see this geodesic dome shape recurring over and over again. And it's because, strictly speaking, like with materials, they are ideally the cheapest, most structurally sound shape. Now, in practice, less so. They are very difficult to run wires in, as you might expect, because there's not really like a gap in the wall in the same way that you would have in a modern house. Also, because it is a dome, if you want to say like put a sofa against a wall, well, you can't really do that because it's spherical. All the walls are curved. And that also is a major issue when it comes into like adding different rooms. It's very difficult to have separation in one of these. And because it's a dome and it extends all the way to the ceiling, well, there's not much privacy inside one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Also, most materials that are used in construction, things like wooden planks or steel slats, well, those are not in a very dome-friendly shape. They're straight lines. You'd have to cut them into pieces, and so that's another factor in cost. All in all, they seem very futuristic, but they're not exactly ideal.
Right. I think about, especially putting them close together, spheres are known for having a very low packing efficiency, which is like how many of them you could fit into effectively a square.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, 40%. That's the reason that's the whole reason we don't use spheres as drink cans, even though they'd be better for pressure. But you also can't get these domes very close together. They're not very efficient on use of just like land and lots and things like that.
Not at all.
It's hard to build a 2-story dome.
Although that actually is a good point. But we're starting to see a sort of resurgence. And I think a lot of this is just because of their association with futurism from the 60s and 70s. But I stumbled upon this word glamping, which I kind of hate.
Oh, I hate that.
Glamour camping. So among this idea of like luxury camping, the geodesic dome is really, really common. People will assemble these domes and fill them with high-class furniture in very beautiful places and charge very high prices to stay in them.
I would like to, just for background for any listeners, Ezra and I are both Eagle Scouts who enjoy camping and just, glamping.
Yeah, absolutely. But there are some neat uses for these domes. In the 2000s, the first fully sustainable Geodesic Dome hotel was created. It's still in operation. In Japan, there was a water park that was completely made out of one of these domes, and it was just huge, multi-stories. It was incredible. And we're starting to still like see them in like cyberpunk and like sci-fi because they have this idea from the future, and that's a leftover from both the World Fair and Epcot. It's interesting to think how much something like just a shape would be associated with the future, but a lot of these things that we associate with that come from the World Fair, like the monorail.
Right, something as far back as the 60s. That's our show for this week. Listen to Are We Doing This Right every Friday at 2 on WEGL 91.1 in Auburn or on WEGLFM.com. Follow us on Twitter at AWDTR Pod, that's AWDTR as in Are We Doing This Right, for notifications of when we go live and when we post recordings of the show. I'm Grayson.
I'm Ezra.
And thank you for listening.
You can recognize a change in